If you are running your CRM in Notion and you're using a pretty simple system to track company data, contact data, and you want a tool to enrich that data that isn't too expensive, then this video might interest you, because we're looking at the company's API, and that's an API that allows you to send a domain or an email address of a company, and it outputs data for that company, including related companies, industries, websites, estimated revenue, and around 80 data points. It has a very generous free tier with credits, and that's why we're looking at it, because it might be useful for you if you are doing things at a small scale. Although the downside is that sometimes it doesn't have data about some small businesses that do not have a very large online presence. So also consider other tools that are more professional, more reliable, though more expensive as well, like Clay or Clearbit or Crunchbase, that do have an API and can also provide this data for enrichment purposes of your CRM, although they are more expensive than the company's API. So depending on your preferences and use case, test things out and check out their documentation. In this video, we are specifically looking at the company's API and how you can use it simply if you have a simple CRM in Notion to enrich data, find leads of potential companies that you might reach out to for your services, and keep everything organized in one place together with your project management system, if you wish. Here is an example database of companies with their website URL, and then there are properties that I pulled from the company's API documentation. I just got the JSON, I pasted it into a JSON to CSV converter, and then in my Notion database that consisted of a name and a URL, I went on the three dots and then selected merge with CSV and then imported all the columns in one go. So then in my scenario, I can map the data to each column from the company's API. One way to make this work practically is I have this list of companies here. Let's say these are your clients. As part of your sales system, you might log deals, link them to companies, and at some point you might want to scrape data about companies. So then you might have a button like this that triggers a webhook. And if I click on any of these, let's say Figma, Enrich, this will start the automation, which will then fill out some of these properties after the scraping happens. So as you can see here, I now have some of this data. Industries separated by comma, the main industry, the total employees, range, the year founded, the place where it was founded, and other data. Not all the data is available for every company. So some data is returned by the API, other data is not returned. So be aware of that. And some of these could be made into relation properties, for example, with other databases. So that's your choice in terms of the architecture. This one is just a simple example to show you practically how we can use this tool and get all the data about companies merely by having the URL sent to the company's API. So now let's go into the automation and see exactly how this is built and how you can build this yourself to make it work as you wish. The first thing to make this work is having a database that stores company data like this one. And we can use the website URL or an email address to enrich the company data. And in here, an example is we can trigger this manually via a webhook. So you can click a button and that will trigger the enrichment process. Alternatively, this could be also done automatically via a polling trigger, meaning a trigger that in Make, N8N, or whatever tool you're using, checks the database for new companies every 1 minute, 2 minutes, every day, whatever you like, and then it scrapes the data from the company's API. If you want to set up a webhook, the option that I implemented here is a button. This is a button property in Notion, and the automation has one step. When the button is clicked, then send the webhook to the make webhook that I set up in my make scenario. If you're using N8N, then it will be an N8N URL. If you're using Zapier, same thing. And then I send the properties. I just send the website URL because that's the only thing that I need in my case to pass data to the company's API and get the output. This is the company's API documentation. You can see here there's a companies section. You can find out more about the authentication and how it works here in the dedicated section. And we can enrich companies from domain, from email address, from social network, and then we can do other operations for companies. And one of the ones that I find interesting is to search similar companies, which is something that, if you notice in my database, I added a relation property to the same database so that if you wish, for example, to automate finding leads or similar companies from your clients that you have in your database, then that endpoint can be quite powerful, because you can find similar companies to your existing clients, add them to your database, maybe with the status of lead. Then you can check more data about them and maybe reach out to them with your offer if you find that they can be a good fit, especially if you're in your service business and you want to do direct reach out that is not totally out of the blue, but that has a purpose and it has data behind it. Here is the make scenario. We can build this in Any10, in Zapier, or any other tool as well. These are just API calls. You can see here the first trigger is a webhook. That's the URL that I pasted in my Notion button to trigger instantaneously this automation. I then close the window, because when you click the webhook, it opens a separate window. Although in this case, because we're using a Notion database button, we don't need this one here, because when I click a button in Notion, it doesn't really open a new window in the browser. So once the webhook is triggered, you can see the data that is passed through it. There is the ID of the Notion page that's unique for each page, the URL of that page, and then within the properties, there is the properties that are included in the payload. In my case, I only selected the website URL because that's the only one that I need. And you can see here is the website URL that was passed in this example when scraping Figma. The second step is we retrieve company data based on the URL. So in here, I set up the companies API endpoint, which I found in the documentation, v2/companies/domain. And the domain needs to be only the domain. And that's why I'm using this replace function here to replace the HTTP, the //www. So just strip everything out besides the core domain here. If you notice that your domains are very different in how they are set up in a Notion database, that you might also use an AI step or a more complex regex function to handle this and make sure the domain is passed properly and that the API doesn't return an error message because the domain is not formatted as expected. The method is get, then there is the authorization, which is a basic authorization for the company's API. So we just include the header here. The key is authorization and the value is basic followed by your API key. You can find that in the company's API panel once you make an account. And there is no body in the request here. We just send the domain in the URL and it returns data like this. So there is data and then there is data about that company. Some companies return more data than others. It just depends on how much data is publicly available and the capacity of the company's API as well to access that data. Once we have this data, we can update the company data in Notion via an update database item module, where we map the database ID from Notion because I know that it's always the same database. I don't need to map it dynamically. Otherwise, I could enter manually here. Then the database item ID, meaning the page that we update, we can take that from the webhook because the webhook gives us the ID of that page. So we can map it easily here to identify the page to update. And then we can map all the data from the company's API, the name, and here are all the data that I didn't really clean up for this demo from the company's API documentation. But we can map all of these, or some of them, depending on what you like, in the Notion database, like so. To go one step further, we could search similar companies. As I said, that could be a use case that's of interest to you. And you can see here is how to do it. We use this URL for the API request, same authentication, and then in the query parameters, we pass the domains that we want to find similar companies to. So in our case, we would pass figma.com and it would find similar companies to Figma and then output those companies in an array like this, as you can see. So if we look at make, after updating the company data, in this case Figma, we could then go into another route to search similar companies to Figma via that URL endpoint. And then we can iterate over them because it's an array, so we can extract each of them individually. And then we can search our database in Notion. If that company already exists, we can search by domain or by a unique ID if we store it in the database. And then if it doesn't exist, we can create it in the Notion database and then use the relation property that I showed you earlier to link the similarity between these companies. And if that company already exists, then we can just link it to Figma in this case to keep trace of that similarity that was detected by the company's API. That's it for this video. If you have questions, leave a comment below or contact me. There is a link in the description for that. If you want to work together, then contact me as well. For now, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.